I don't think I did anything wrong. I just wanted a little attention, and it happened to be from his older brother, the day after our wedding. It wasn't planned, not really, but now I'm standing here with an envelope that says everything he never had to yell. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Marla, and I don't think I did anything wrong. I just wanted to feel noticed again. That's how it started, the day after our wedding, when everything was still perfect in everyone else's eyes. The flowers hadn't even wilted, the champagne bottles were still half full, and I was still being called the beautiful bride. Eli was outside on the patio thanking guests, already talking about our flight schedule, bills, and house repairs. I remember thinking, is this what marriage feels like? A checklist before the honeymoon. Then Luke, his older brother, found me by the kitchen, glass in hand, smiling like he saw right through me. He said I looked restless. Maybe I was. He said I deserved to celebrate, that I shouldn't fade into routine before the ink on the license dried. I laughed because it felt true. I told myself it was just a joke, just a moment. But it wasn't. It happened so quickly, so quietly, that even now I can't decide if it was an accident or a choice. All I know is that one night became a secret, and that secret is now written in legal ink I can't erase. The morning after our wedding felt unreal, like waking up inside someone else's dream. The bed still smelled of roses and perfume, and I could hear waves breaking against the rocks outside the beach house. Eli was already up, of course. I heard the faint clink of mugs from the kitchen, his careful movements that never disturbed a single thing. He's always been like that. Quiet, predictable. The kind of man who folds his napkin even when no one's watching. I used to say that was comforting. Lately, it just feels like distance wrapped in politeness. When I walked in, he looked up from his phone and smiled that small, measured smile of his. He said good morning like we were in a hotel lobby instead of our honeymoon suite. I asked if he'd slept at all. He said he didn't sleep much when there was cleaning to do. I laughed and told him he was ridiculous. He said old habits die hard. He always uses lines like that, gentle, reasonable, leaving no space for emotion. I poured myself coffee and told him people were still messaging me about how perfect the wedding was. He nodded but didn't look up. I asked if he liked the cake, the music, the speeches. He said it was all fine. That word, fine, has followed us since we met. It's the sound of something safe but empty. Luke came down a little later, barefoot, shirtless, like he didn't belong in the same family as Eli at all. He has that casual kind of confidence that fills a room without trying. He said the wedding was incredible, that I looked like a movie star. Eli just smiled at the comment and kept scrolling through his phone. I told Luke not to flatter me, but he said I deserved it. It was a simple line, but the way he said it made my skin prickle. The night before, when everyone had left the reception and the band was packing up, Luke and I had stayed behind to finish the last glass of champagne. He said he couldn't believe his little brother got married first. I told him he could still catch up if he stopped chasing women half his age. He laughed, and I remember how close we were standing under the dim lights. It felt harmless, until it didn't. Back in the kitchen, Luke poured himself coffee and asked if Eli had opened the gifts yet. Eli said he'd do it later. Luke raised an eyebrow and said, "You're really not in a rush for anything, huh?" Eli smiled faintly and replied, "Patience has kept me out of a lot of trouble." I remember how that sentence hung in the air, heavy but polite. The three of us ate breakfast together, and it felt almost normal. But there was a pulse beneath everything, something unsaid that kept the air tight. I kept looking at Luke, wondering if he was going to mention what happened. He didn't. He just played his role, teasing Eli about work, asking when we'd leave for the airport, laughing at his own jokes. Eli stayed calm, almost distant. At one point, He excused himself to take a call outside. That's when Luke looked at me, and the silence between us felt like static. He said quietly, "We should probably forget it happened." I said, "It was nothing anyway." He nodded, then added, "Sometimes nothing turns into something." I wanted to tell him to stop, to leave it there, but instead I said, "You're making it sound worse than it was." He gave a small smile. "I'm just saying be careful. Eli's not as oblivious as you think." When Eli came back, he kissed my forehead and said he had to check the car before the drive. I said I'd pack. He asked me to make sure the wedding cards were in the blue box by the door. I said sure. It was such an ordinary exchange that it almost erased the wrongness in the air. Almost. While he was outside, Luke came back into the kitchen. He stood close, too close, pretending to reach for something on the counter. I told him to stop, that this was stupid. He said, "You kissed me first." I said, "You didn't have to kiss back." He laughed quietly and said, "You didn't look like you wanted me to stop." The words hit me like cold water, but not because they were wrong. They were true. I hated that he said them so casually. I told him it didn't matter, that we both needed to forget it. He said fine, but his tone didn't match the word. Then Eli's voice called from outside, asking where his keys were. Luke walked off as if nothing happened. I stood there staring at the counter, wishing I could scrub away the whole moment like a stain. We drove back to the city that afternoon. Eli talked about flight confirmations, car rentals, small errands we needed to run before the honeymoon. I nodded at all the right times, said yes when he asked if I wanted water, smiled when he pointed at the ocean. It was a movie version of a marriage, every line rehearsed. At one point, I asked if he was happy. He said, of course, why wouldn't he be? I wanted to ask if he meant it, but something in his tone warned me not to. When we reached the apartment, he carried our bags upstairs while I checked my phone. A message from Luke flashed on the screen. "Don't worry, I'll never tell." I froze. For a second, I thought Eli might see it, but he was busy unpacking. I deleted it immediately. My hands were shaking, but I told myself it was fine. It was just a message, just a reassurance. It didn't mean anything. Later that evening, I tried to lighten the mood. I told Eli that married life suited him, that he looked more serious already. He smiled faintly and said, "Marriage isn't a costume." I laughed and told him not to start giving speeches. He said he wasn't. He said he just hoped we could be honest with each other. That word made my throat dry. I said, "Of course we can. Why wouldn't we?" He looked at me for a long second, then nodded. When he went to bed, I stayed on the balcony, scrolling through photos from the wedding. Everyone looked so happy. There was one of Eli and Luke standing side by side, almost identical except for the way they held themselves. Eli's posture was straight, composed. Luke leaned slightly forward, half smiling, like he was in on a joke no one else knew. I thought about deleting the picture but didn't. Instead, I posted it on my story with the caption, "Lucky to marry into such a strong family." The irony didn't hit me until later. The next morning, Eli left early. He said he needed to pick something up from the office before our trip. I stayed behind, tidying the apartment, pretending it was just a normal day. When I opened the drawer for scissors, I noticed a small notebook inside, plain black, nothing fancy. I flipped it open. Each page was filled with dates, notes, little reminders in his neat handwriting. The last one read, "Monday, call storage company, bring forms." I closed it quickly, unsure why it made me uneasy. I spent the afternoon with my friend Clara, telling her about the wedding. I hinted that Eli had been distant, that he seemed distracted. She said all men get weird after weddings, that maybe he just needed time to adjust. Then she laughed and said, "You probably make him nervous. You're too much woman for a guy like that." I liked that line. I repeated it later in my head like a mantra. When Eli got home that evening, he brought dinner from the Thai place I like. He was polite, calm, asking about my day. I tried to match his tone, pretending everything was normal, but his calmness had started to feel like a wall. At one point, I told him he'd make a great lawyer with how carefully he spoke. He looked up and said, "Lawyers use words to protect themselves." I asked what he meant. He said, "Nothing, just thinking out loud." That night, as we got ready for bed, he stood by the mirror adjusting his shirt cuffs. I watched him in the reflection and said, "You're not still upset about anything, right?" He said no. His voice was steady, too steady. I told him I felt like he was keeping score of something. He said, "Maybe I'm just remembering things properly." Then he kissed my forehead, turned off the light, and went to bed. I lay awake for hours, replaying every second of the past 2 days. The kiss, the message, his silence. It was like standing on the edge of a thin sheet of ice, waiting for the crack. I told myself he didn't know, that he couldn't know, but part of me sensed something shifting quietly underneath his calm. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of the beach house again, Luke's hand brushing mine, Eli watching from a distance, the waves crashing louder than before. I woke with my heart pounding and the room too bright. Eli was gone again, his side of the bed smooth and untouched, the faint smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen. On the counter sat 2 mugs, his washed, mine half full and cold. Beside them lay a small folded receipt with neat writing across the back. Downtown 10:45 a.m. I stared at it for a long time before turning it over. It was blank on the other side. I told myself it was nothing, just another one of his endless errands, but my chest felt tight. Something in the air had changed, quiet but certain, like a clock starting to count down. Eli started coming home later after that week. Not late enough to call it suspicious, just the kind of late that feels deliberate. I'd hear the soft jingle of his keys around 9, then the careful sound of the front door closing. Always quiet, never rushed. He'd go straight to the kitchen, pour himself tea, and check his phone with that calm, unreadable face. I used to ask how work was. Now I didn't bother. His answers were too clean. I told myself it was fine. Newlyweds have adjustment periods, right? I started working longer hours too. At least that's what I told him. In truth, I stayed at my office just to avoid the silence that hung around our apartment. The kind of silence that makes every thought sound louder. My coworkers loved the story of our wedding, the beachfront ceremony, the perfect photos. I played the role of the glowing bride so well that even I believed it sometimes. When I got home, Eli would be sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, spreadsheets glowing faintly on the screen. I never asked what he was doing, but I'd see color-coded tabs and neat folders labeled household, utilities, storage. Once, when I leaned over his shoulder to tease him about being such a neat freak, he clicked away from the screen so fast it startled me. I laughed, pretending not to notice. He said, "Just keeping things organized." I said, "You're organizing our whole life away." He didn't look up. "Maybe it needs organizing," he said. I spent that evening on the couch scrolling through social media, reading comments on our wedding photos. One of my bridesmaids had posted a clip of me laughing with Luke at the reception, the one where I leaned in too close. The caption read, "These two are always trouble." I laughed at it, but Eli didn't. He walked by, looked at the screen for a second and asked, "You like that picture?" I said, "Why wouldn't I?" He said nothing, just walked away. It was getting harder to tell if he was angry or indifferent. When he was quiet before, it meant peace. Now it felt like preparation. I started sleeping badly. Every time I woke up, he was already out of bed. The guest room light would be on sometimes, the door half closed. I thought about knocking once, just to ask why he was there, but I stopped myself. What would I say? "Are you avoiding me because I'm lying to you?" Clara invited me to lunch one afternoon and said I looked tense. I told her marriage was harder than I expected. She rolled her eyes and said, "You've been married a month. What could be hard already?" I said Eli had changed. She laughed and said, "Men get comfortable fast, don't overthink it." Then she lowered her voice and asked if Luke had been weird since the wedding. I almost dropped my fork. I asked what she meant. She said she'd seen him at a bar downtown with some friends, and he'd told them, "My brother's wife can't even look at me now." I told her people make things up. She gave me that knowing look, the one friends give when they suspect more than they say. That night, I couldn't look at my phone without feeling sick. I deleted Luke's number, then immediately regretted it. What if he texted me something important? What if Eli saw? My mind ran in circles. When Eli came home, I tried to start a normal conversation. I asked about his day. He said it was productive. I asked what that meant. He said, "Just things I've been meaning to finish." Then he asked if I'd talked to Luke lately. My chest went cold. I said, "Why would I?" He nodded slowly and said, "No reason. Just wondering." I tried to sound offended, but it came out weak. He didn't press. He never pressed anymore, and somehow that scared me more than shouting would have. The next morning, I heard the printer running from the guest room. When I walked past, I saw papers stacked neatly beside the tray. He was sitting there, back straight, eyes fixed on the screen. I asked what he was printing. He said, "Just copies." I asked of what. He said, "Records." I laughed, said, "You're acting like an accountant." He said, "Someone should." I wanted to ask what that meant, but I didn't. He was calmer than ever, which only made me feel more off balance. When I turned to leave, I heard the faint click of a drawer locking behind me. That sound stayed in my ears all day. Later, I went to dinner with my mother. She said Eli seemed distant when she called to thank him for the wedding flowers. I told her he was just busy. She said, "He's quiet in a way that worries me." I asked what she meant. She said, "He's the kind of man who doesn't fight. The ones who don't fight usually build something else instead." I told her she was being dramatic. She sighed and said, "You always say that when you don't want to listen." I came home to an empty apartment again. On the counter were 2 mugs, his washed, mine cold, like always. A sticky note sat beside them. It said, "Pick up forms." No explanation, no context, just those 3 words in his neat handwriting. That weekend, he suggested we have dinner with his parents. I didn't want to, but he said his mother insisted. At the table, Helen asked how married life was. I said it was wonderful, but Eli just smiled and said, "It's an adjustment." His father, Walter, changed the subject, asking about our honeymoon plans. I said we might delay it. Eli said, "We've already postponed it." I turned to him, startled. "We have." He nodded. "Flights are cancelled. It's not the right time." Luke wasn't there that night, which was a relief until Helen mentioned he'd been helping her with house repairs lately. She said he'd been quiet lately too. "Must be something in the family," she joked. Eli didn't laugh. When we got home, I finally asked what he meant about cancelling the trip. He said he didn't think we needed one right now. I asked if that was because of money. He said, "Because we have things to sort first." I asked what things. He said, "You'll see." That answer felt like a trap I couldn't find the edges of. The next morning, he was already dressed when I woke up. He said he had a meeting. I asked if it was about work. He said, "Personal." Then he kissed my cheek, too softly, and left. All day, I couldn't shake the image of that black notebook in the drawer. When I finally gave in and opened it again that night, a new entry was written in the same precise handwriting. Tuesday, downtown, 11:20. I stared at it, wondering if it was about me, about us, or something else entirely. That night, I dreamed again of the beach house. Luke's voice in my ear, the sound of waves, Eli standing on the porch watching. When I woke, the bed beside me was cold. The notebook was gone from the drawer. At breakfast, he was calm, almost cheerful. He asked if I'd be working late again. I said maybe. He nodded and said, "Let me know if you'll be home after 10. I asked why. He said, "Just planning my time." After he left, Clara called, her voice low and urgent. She said Luke had stopped answering her messages. She thought he was avoiding people. I told her to leave it alone, that he was probably fine. She asked if I'd told Eli anything. I said no, of course not. She sighed and said, "You're playing with fire, Marla. He's not stupid." That afternoon, I came home early. Eli wasn't there yet. The guest room door was unlocked for once. Inside, everything was neat to the point of discomfort. The desk was bare, except for a USB stick labeled with a date, tucked under a stack of invoices. I didn't touch it, but the sight of it made my throat tighten. When Eli came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "You seem restless." I said, "You seem busy." He nodded. "We're both right." He made tea and we sat in silence. I tried to act normal, but every small movement, his reaching for a spoon, his phone buzzing once, felt like evidence gathering. I wanted to ask if we were okay, but I was afraid of what he might say if I gave him the chance. Instead, I said I wanted to throw a small dinner for friends. He asked why. I said because people think we're boring now. He smiled faintly and said, "If you want to show them something, make sure it's true." I asked what that was supposed to mean. He said, "You'll understand eventually." Then he rinsed his mug and went to the guest room again. I sat there for a long time after the door closed, the faint hum of the printer starting up again. The sound filled the apartment like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore. That night, I checked his calendar on the fridge. There was a new reminder written neatly in the corner. Meeting, personal. The date was circled twice in blue ink. I went to bed telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew whatever Eli was building wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was something waiting to unfold, something with my name on it. By the time our second month of marriage rolled around, everything that had once felt romantic started to sound like background noise. Eli and I still shared a space, but it didn't feel like we shared a life. He'd moved most of his work things into the guest room completely now. Laptop, files, even his favorite mug. When I asked about it, he said it was easier for him to concentrate. I joked that he just wanted to escape my late-night TV habits. He smiled politely and said, "Something like that." We still ate dinner together, but conversation had become mechanical. He'd ask about my day. I'd answer in half sentences. When I asked about his, he said, "Productive," that same word again. I began to feel like he was keeping score of everything I said, storing it somewhere I couldn't reach. The apartment was too clean, too still. Even the air felt measured. At work, I found comfort in noise. My team had been celebrating the launch of a new campaign, and my boss, Janice, said I was the energy of the office. I leaned into it. I wore brighter clothes, laughed louder, told stories about married life that weren't exactly true. People loved them. They loved when I joked that my husband treated schedules like religion. I didn't tell them how the silence between us had started to feel like a sentence. That Friday, my coworkers decided to go out for drinks after work. I almost said no, but Clara texted that she'd be there too, so I went. The place was loud and warm, full of light. I hadn't felt that alive in weeks. After 2 glasses of wine, someone asked if marriage had changed me. I said it made me patient, then laughed and added, "Or maybe it just made me quieter, since my husband doesn't talk much." They laughed. Then someone said, "Maybe he's intimidated. You're too much for him." I smiled and didn't disagree. It was easy to keep going after that. Easy to lean into the version of myself people liked. The bold, confident woman with the quiet husband who didn't appreciate her. I said things I shouldn't have. I told a story about how Eli always triple checks receipts, how he tracks every expense like a detective. They laughed again, so I went further. I said, "He's the kind of man who'd make a spreadsheet before kissing you." That one got the biggest laugh. I saw phones lifted, someone recording. I pretended not to notice. When I got home that night, The apartment lights were off except for the lamp in the hallway. Eli was sitting on the couch, laptop closed. He asked if I had fun. I said, "Yeah, just work people." He nodded slowly, studying my face. Then he asked if I'd been drinking. I said, "A bit, nothing crazy." He said, "You laugh differently when you drink." I asked what that was supposed to mean. He said, "It's louder, but it sounds like you're trying to prove something." I told him he was overanalyzing, that not everything had to mean something. He said, "You're right, some things just show themselves." His tone wasn't angry, just careful. He got up, rinsed his glass, and went to the guest room. I stood there staring at the empty hallway, feeling an urge to scream just to get a reaction from him. The next morning, the kitchen smelled like coffee and printer toner. I found a stack of papers on the counter. Nothing was written on them, just blank sheets. The printer light blinked red. I picked one up, feeling the faint warmth from fresh ink. I heard Eli's voice behind me, soft, calm. He said, "Don't touch those. They're drying." I turned around and said, "They're blank." He replied, "Not everything shows up right away." Then he took the pages and carried them back to the guest room. Later that week, my company hosted a networking brunch, and I invited Eli to come along. He said he had errands, so I went alone. The event was crowded: clients, investors, photographers. Someone asked where my husband was, and I said he was too serious for social things. People laughed again. I felt powerful, admired. When the photographer asked for a fun shot, I leaned in toward my boss, joking that I'd rather be married to my job. The next day, the photo was online. In the background, my ring caught the light, but my smile looked freer than it should have. Comments poured in. Someone tagged me saying, "Marla knows how to work a room." I reposted it with a wink emoji. Hours later, Eli texted, "You looked like you were having fun." I typed back, "Just part of the job." He didn't reply. That evening, I walked into the apartment to find him cooking dinner, something he hadn't done in weeks. I tried to make a joke about him finally missing me. He said, "I just didn't want the place to smell like takeout anymore." His tone was even, polite. During dinner, he said he wanted to invite my parents for the weekend. I asked why. He said, "I think it's time everyone had clarity." I didn't know what that meant, but it unsettled me. He rarely involved my parents in anything, let alone serious conversations. I asked if something was wrong. He said, "Nothing wrong, just overdue." When the weekend came, my parents arrived with small gifts and polite smiles. Eli greeted them warmly, poured coffee, made conversation about traffic and weather. Everything looked normal, too normal. Then he asked about their house repairs, their insurance, their wills. My father looked puzzled, but answered politely. My mother asked what brought that on. Eli said, "I've been thinking about how families protect what they build." I excused myself to the kitchen, feeling suddenly nauseous. My mother followed me, whispering, "What's going on with him?" I said I didn't know. When we came back to the table, Eli had opened his laptop. He was showing my father a spreadsheet about household finances, savings, accounts, everything labeled precisely. He said, "It's all organized for transparency." My father nodded, impressed. My mother smiled faintly. I smiled too, pretending this was all just him being responsible. But I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. That night, when my parents left, Eli said, "They seemed relieved." I said, "About what?" He said, "About us. I think they believe things are stable." I asked if that was what he wanted them to believe. He looked at me calmly. "I want them to understand what stability looks like." Then he turned away. The next day at work, Clara pulled me aside. She said someone had uploaded a clip from the bar night. Me laughing about Eli, the spreadsheet comment, everything. It had gone mildly viral in our company's internal chat. "People are calling it the accountant's wife bit," she said, half amused, half worried. I felt my stomach twist. I asked who posted it. She shrugged. Probably one of the guys. You were funny, but—" She trailed off. I left early that day, too humiliated to stay. When I got home, Eli was at the dining table again, same calm posture. I asked if he'd seen it. He said, "Of course." I said, "I was joking." He said, "I know." I asked if he was angry. He said, "No, just taking notes." That sentence landed heavier than any argument we'd ever had. I told him he was making this bigger than it was. He said, "Maybe it's already big." I said, "You don't even talk to me anymore." He said, "I talk. You just don't listen when the words aren't flattering." I felt my throat tighten. I said, "You're acting like a stranger." He said, "Strangers tell the truth easier." He stood up, took his laptop, and walked toward the guest room. I followed him halfway down the hall before stopping myself. I couldn't decide if I wanted to scream or cry or both. The apartment felt too large after he closed the door. I poured myself wine, sat on the couch, and scrolled through comments on the clip. Some called me hilarious, others called me cruel. One person wrote, "She doesn't realize how lucky she is." I hated that one most. Hours later, when Eli came out, he was wearing his coat. I asked where he was going. He said, "For air." I asked if he was coming back. He said, "I always come back." Then he left, leaving the front door slightly ajar. I stood there, hearing the faint hum of the printer again from the guest room, the same steady rhythm that had started to haunt me. I walked in and saw the blank sheet stacked again, one still half-fed through the tray. I reached out, and words appeared faintly across the top of the page, like something unfinished. Incident. Public. I froze. Behind me, the hallway light flickered from the draft of the open door. I pulled the sheet free, my hand trembling. The rest of the line was missing, but one thing was clear. The paper wasn't blank this time. It was a record. Of what? I didn't know yet. But I could feel it now. The quiet precision of his revenge taking shape, as inevitable as the sound of that printer turning back on. Eli stopped sleeping in our bed altogether after that week. There was no argument, no dramatic scene, just a quiet shift, like something had been agreed upon without being spoken. I'd hear the guest room door close at night and the faint click of his lamp turning off. Some mornings I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of the shredder humming faintly, then silence. He was still polite, even kind in small ways. He'd pour me tea, leave the mail neatly stacked, ask if I needed the car. But underneath that civility was a cold distance that made me feel like a guest in my own marriage. Sometimes I caught him watching me, the way you might watch a stranger on the street, curious, detached, quietly studying. I told Clara everything one afternoon. We were at a cafe near the office, and I said I thought Eli was keeping track of things. She asked what I meant, and I told her about the papers, the lists, the blank sheets that weren't blank anymore. She laughed at first, then saw I wasn't joking. "Marla, you're spiraling," she said. "Maybe he's just reorganizing finances. You've always liked dramatic explanations." I wanted to believe her, but her voice sounded too soft, too careful, like she didn't believe it herself. When I got home that night, Eli was sitting on the couch with a book. He looked peaceful, almost content. I stood there for a moment, just watching him, wondering what it would take to make him react. I said, "I heard Luke's been avoiding family dinners." He didn't look up. He said, "He has." I asked if he'd spoken to him. He said, "Briefly." I waited for him to ask me why I cared, but he didn't. So I said it myself. "He's your brother. You should fix things." He turned a page slowly. Some things don't need fixing. They just need documenting. I went cold. The way he said it, like Luke was an entry in a file, not a person, made me realize how deep this had gone. I wanted to fight back, to take control of the story before he turned it into whatever he was building. So I said, "You're acting like I did something unforgivable." He looked at me then, calm as ever. "Didn't you?" The words hit harder than if he'd shouted. I said, "You don't know what you're talking about." He said, "I know enough." and then he went back to his book. A few days later, Helen invited us to Sunday lunch at her house. I didn't want to go, but Eli said we should. His voice left no room for argument. When we arrived, Luke's car was already in the driveway. My stomach twisted. Inside, Helen greeted us warmly, but her eyes flicked between me and her sons with quiet calculation. Walter sat at the head of the table, cheerful but distracted. Luke barely looked at me. His face was drawn, tired. At one point, he said he'd been busy with work, and Helen scolded him for missing dinners. He shrugged, saying he'd been staying out of the way. Eli said, "That's probably wise." No one spoke after that for a long minute. The clinking of cutlery sounded like static. After lunch, Helen pulled me aside into the garden. She said, "Marla, I don't know what's happened, but my sons barely speak to each other." I told her it was nothing, just misunderstandings. She said, "You've always been good with words, but this isn't something you can explain away." I wanted to defend myself, to tell her that Eli was the one pulling away, that I'd been trying. But she looked at me with a kind of pity that made me stop. When we left, Eli thanked her for lunch and promised to visit again soon. On the drive home, he didn't say a word. I finally asked what that had been about. He said, "Just closure." I said, "Closure for who?" He said, "For her." That night, he didn't go to the guest room immediately. He sat across from me in the living room and asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I said, "That's a strange thing to ask now." He said, "It's not strange. It's necessary." I told him I didn't know. He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "That's honest," he said. Then he added, "I wish you'd tried that earlier." He went to bed without another word. The next morning, I woke up to the faint sound of the printer again. The smell of toner hung in the air, sharper this time. When I walked to the hallway, the guest room door was half open. On his desk sat a neat stack of papers clipped together. The top one had a heading I could barely make out from the doorway. Timeline. My stomach turned. I didn't dare step closer. Later that day, I tried calling Luke. He didn't answer. I sent him a message saying we needed to talk, but it stayed unread. In a moment of panic, I even called his mother, pretending I'd left something at her house. She said Luke had come by earlier, looking pale, asking for family photos. He said he was sorting things for Eli, she said. That evening, Eli came home early for once. He looked calm, composed, almost gentle. I asked if something was wrong. He said, "No, just tying up loose ends." I asked what kind. He smiled faintly. "Personal ones." I tried to keep my voice steady. "You're scaring me." He said, "There's nothing to be scared of. Everything will be handled properly." He turned off the lights and went to the guest room, closing the door behind him. I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the faint glow seeping under that door. I could hear the low hum of the printer again, steady as breathing. Then a soft beep, like a phone recording, had stopped. That night, I dreamed of Luke again, his hand brushing mine in the kitchen, the flash of guilt, the door opening to Eli's silhouette. When I woke, dawn light filled the room. The guest room door was open now, empty. On the desk sat a single USB drive, labeled with yesterday's date. Eli was gone, but on the fridge was a note in his handwriting. "Dinner tomorrow, family." No explanation, no apology, just that one line. I stared at it for a long time before realizing what it meant. He was planning something final and public. The morning felt unusually still. Eli was already gone when I woke, leaving behind only the faint smell of coffee and the quiet hum of the apartment. I could hear the faint click of a drawer closing somewhere down the hall. It was subtle, almost easy to ignore. But it made my stomach knot. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just being meticulous as usual. By mid-morning, I was restless. I wandered from room to room, trying to occupy myself, but the apartment felt empty in a way it hadn't before. The papers on his desk from the guest room caught my eye again. I didn't touch them. Their presence alone was enough to remind me of the distance that had grown between us. Every little noise, the refrigerator, the clock, the faint rattle of a passing car, seemed amplified. When he returned, he was calm, composed, and polite in a way that made my chest tighten. He asked if I'd been working late, and I said maybe, though I hadn't. He nodded and replied, "Good to stay occupied." I laughed nervously, but the sound rang hollow. Dinner that evening was quiet. Eli moved with precision, pouring wine, setting the plates, arranging utensils. I tried to make conversation, asking about his day, but his responses were clipped, neutral. "Just errands," he said almost casually, but the word carried weight. I pressed further. "What errands?" He smiled faintly. "Things that need order." I laughed lightly, trying to mask the tension. "You sound like a lawyer keeping track of evidence." He looked at me steadily. "Some things do need documentation." The calmness of his voice made me shiver. Later, I suggested a small dinner with friends. He asked why. I said people think we're boring now, that it would be fun. He nodded slowly. "If you want to show them something, make sure it's true," he said. I swallowed hard, unsure if he meant honesty or a warning. He didn't elaborate. The next morning, he was already dressed when I came into the kitchen. 2 mugs were on the counter, his clean, mine half full and cold. He asked if I was ready. I said I wasn't sure. He said, "You'll understand soon." His tone was calm, steady, unshakable. When we drove, he didn't turn toward any familiar route. He went downtown, and I realized we weren't heading to an ordinary errand. I asked where we were going. He said softly, "You'll see." My heart thumped, but I forced myself to nod. We arrived at a familiar restaurant, the one where we'd had our rehearsal dinner. My stomach twisted as we walked inside. Familiar faces filled the tables, his parents, mine, even Luke sitting stiffly at the far end. Everyone turned when we entered. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anticipation and dread. Eli's voice cut through the room, calm and steady. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I wanted to ensure clarity and honesty." He gestured for us to sit. I did, hands trembling slightly. Luke avoided my gaze entirely. My parents exchanged glances, uncertain but attentive. He placed a folder on the table and said, "This contains documentation regarding our marriage and decisions moving forward. I wanted everyone here to hear it directly." I froze as he slid one copy toward me, another toward his father. Eli spoke slowly, deliberately. "There is no anger here, only facts. I have filed for annulment based on infidelity, with financial and property protections effective immediately." Silence fell. My mother covered her mouth. Helen looked down at her lap. Walter blinked at Eli, trying to process. Luke muttered under his breath, and I felt the room tilt around me. I asked, my voice shaking, "You're doing this here, in front of everyone?" Eli's eyes met mine evenly. "Where it started is where it ends," he said. "You wanted witnesses. I've brought them." I tried to protest, to claim misunderstanding, but words failed me. Eli's calm composure was more powerful than any outburst. He wasn't cruel. He was methodical, precise, undeniable. He turned to Luke. "I am not angry, but I am done pretending not to see." Luke nodded, unable to speak. I glanced at my father, who opened his mouth to speak, but Eli cut him off softly. "It is already done. The petition was filed this morning. I only wanted to deliver it properly." Eli stood, placing his wedding ring carefully on the table. "Marla will receive her copy through counsel. There is nothing left to discuss." He turned to leave. I reached out instinctively, but he stepped aside, and my hand caught only air. He said quietly, "You'll be fine. You've always been skilled at telling stories. Now you'll need a new one." He walked out without looking back. Luke remained frozen in his chair. Helen's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and my mother whispered my name softly, almost like a prayer. I stared at the folder on the table. The top page bore my name in neat black ink, alongside Eli's. Petition for annulment, filed and served. Everything I thought I controlled, every version of the story I told myself, had been replaced by his quiet, lawful precision. I tried to speak, but my voice failed. The room felt bright and oppressive. A phone buzzed somewhere, unnoticed. My mother reached for my hand, but I couldn't feel her touch. I opened the folder, my fingers trembling. The first page was a timeline. Dates, messages, receipts, screenshots. Everything catalogued, everything verified. Each entry a quiet assertion of truth that no denial could undo. Eli hadn't shouted, hadn't accused, hadn't threatened. He had simply built the record, composed and lawful, and placed it in front of the people who had once believed I was in control. The quiet authority of his presence, the meticulous organization, the calm delivery, it was more powerful than any fight. And in that moment, I realized that everything I thought I could manipulate had finally slipped from my grasp. He didn't look back when he walked out. The clerk arrived minutes later, asking me to sign for receipt of service. My hands shook as I wrote my name beside his. Around me, no one spoke. Luke stared at the floor, Helen whispered a prayer, and I sat there, staring at the black ink drying beside my own, proof that the story was finally over.